In October 2020, we made history at the Southmorton Boxing Club by staging the world's first behind-closed-doors white-collar boxing show. We got over 10,000 views on the night across 103 countries. Now we're bringing the live rumble back, bigger and better than before. Follow the fighters in the build-up and vote on the night for your favourites. See all the thrills, spills and skills from the best in white-collar boxing, live and free at the KO Cup. Okay, Peter, so only really one subject to talk about today. I think, the news came through, a real surprising shock came through on late on Saturday night that Marvelous Marvin Hagler had passed away at the age of 66. Really came out of the blue. And so, just really wanted to talk about that. The first of the four kings has fallen. And, I wanted to just recap on his life, his achievements. And I was thinking about this over the weekend and I was thinking, do you know what? I don't think I could really think what boxing would be like without Marvin Hagler. He came to epitomise it and symbolise it in so many ways in that period from sort of 1980 to 87. He was the face of boxing for some time. And there's something about him, about his grit, his determination, his chin, his resilience, his aggression, his fire in the ring, his explosiveness, his excitement that that really made a lot of people fall in love with boxing. All over again. And so I just wanted to recap, on Marvin's career really and how it all came to pass. Now, he's sadly gone. But, it all started. So May the 23rd, 1954, he was born in Newark, New Jersey. His father left home at a very early age. So his mother was left to bring up the children alone. Newark was a really rough, ghetto, difficult place, very, very strong mother figure, very loving mother figure. Often wouldn't let Marvin out because it was dangerous to go out. And there was all sorts of pitfalls that it could fall into there. Marvin was quite a loner, and this was really a characteristic that he would, he'd exhibit throughout his life. Sort of quiet and reserved. In 1967, there were terrible riots in Newark, terrible race riots in Newark. 26 people were killed. The mother was sheltering the children on the floor of the tenement apartment. Bullets were coming through the window, embedding themselves in the wall. The tenement building was burnt down. And Hagler's mother was, I've got to get the kids out of here. They had some relatives in Brockton, Massachusetts. So in 1967, they took what they had left and they moved to Brockton, Massachusetts. Now, as many boxing fans will know, Brockton was the home of Rocky Marciano, the Brockton blockbuster. So it had a bit of a boxing pedigree in Brockton. Hagler was there for a couple of years, and then he had an incident where he was beaten up by a kid on the street. The kid turned out to be a boxer. So there wasn't a lot Marvin could do about it, but Marvin thought, you know what, if I'm going to defend myself, I'm going to have to learn to box as well. So he went down to the local boxing gym. It was run by Pat and Goody Petronelli in downtown Brockton, Massachusetts. And he went in there, just sat there for the first day and watched everything. And then I remember hearing Pat Goody say, a few years later, the second day he came in, they said, well, let's put some gloves on you, show you what it's all about. They chucked him in, he sparred, had a bloody nose. Didn't look too great, left the gym, and they said, well, that's the last we'll see of that kid. But he was there the next day, and the next day, and the next day, and the next day, and he became obviously one of their exemplary, outstanding students. There were some tournaments he couldn't go in, he was under 16, so he changed his birth date from 1954 to 1952 so that he could compete in some of these tournaments. He did very well as an amateur. He actually finished his amateur career with a record of 55 wins and 1 loss. But he wasn't a kind of stellar standout as an amateur in that sense. I know, he wasn't losing, but he in 1973, for example, he went to the Golden Gloves and lost in the semi-finals. At that same Golden Gloves, Sugar Ray Leonard won. Now, Sugar Ray Leonard then was an amateur boxing superstar. So, everybody was talking about him. He was absolutely sort of deified as an amateur, if you like. And, Marvin was kind of just another one of the guys that was good. And then later in that year, 1973, he won the AAU Championship, the American Athletic Union National Championships. In 1973, went to see his manager, Petronelli, and said, look, I want to turn pro. And they said, well, why don't you wait for the Montreal Olympics? That's in 3 years' time, and you could get a place there. It'd be a much better start to your pro career. Marvin said, no, I want to earn some money. I think I've got as far as I can in the amateurs. I want to turn pro. So in 1973, he turned pro. And then it was a kind of hard upbringing, really. His first fight in 1973, he was paid $50 for. He was obviously a dangerous operator, very good. He kept winning and winning and winning as a pro, but it was difficult to get fights. And he kept, he really had to go to other guys' backyards, come up the hard way. Nobody did him any favours. It was the story of his life, really. Early on, he was having trouble getting fights and having trouble getting the right opponents and all that sort of stuff. And Joe Frazier, famously, he went to Joe Frazier's gym to do a bit of training. And he said, I'm having trouble progressing and all this sort of stuff. And Frazier said to him, well, look, you've got 3 strikes against you. That's what you've got to remember. 1, you're black. 2, you're a southpaw. And 3, you're good. So nobody wants to fight you. So, he did have to battle against this, and he took that to heart. And in 1976, incidentally, the Montreal Olympics in 1976, of course, Sugar Ray Leonard won the gold. He was the darling, the winning smile, came back, had his first pro fight, and made $40,000, which was more than Marvin had made in his entire career so far, boxing as a pro since 1973. So the Petronelli brothers decided, at this stage of his career, we kind of got to throw Marvin in at the deep end. There's no other way to do it. They went to the cauldron of middleweight boxing, which was Philadelphia. You had guys like Boogaloo Watts, Benny Briscoe, Willie the Worm Monroe, Sugar Ray Seals, these type of guys, today they would be world champions. But in that cauldron, Marvin had to go, and he had to fight his way through. In 1976, in 3 fights, he had 2 losses, 2 points losses, to Boogaloo Watts and to Willie the Worm Monroe. He later reversed those losses. He also had a draw with Sugar Ray Seals. Sugar Ray Seals was 1972 gold medalist, Olympic medalist, and Marvin beat him in the first fight, drew in the second fight. So in 1976, things weren't looking for good for Marvin. I'm saying that he had, 2 losses in 3 fights. It was almost a third strike and you're out type thing. He had to rescue his career. So then he went on a stellar run. He wasn't to lose again until 1987. After that the last 76 reverse. So he went on a sort of, he started knocking everyone out. His knockout ratio in the end of his career was 78%. So he was a very, very dangerous puncher. So from 1976 to 1979, he was really sort of racing through the middleweight division, but he couldn't get a title shot. Nobody wanted to fight him. He was in the Who Needs You club. And, this was, Marvin was getting frustrated. He was thinking about going to another manager, leaving the Petronelli brothers. Didn't want to, but he just needed these connections to get a fight. The Petronelli brothers, very cleverly, actually went to politicians, and they wrote to Senator Ted Kennedy and Tip O'Neill, who was then the Speaker of the House of Representatives, and said, look, this is completely unfair. We're being frozen out by this boxing cartel. We can't get our guy a shot. He's knocking everyone out. He's gone through the middleweight division. He can't get a shot. Ted Kennedy and Tip O'Neill wrote to Bob Arum and said, listen, unless you want a congressional investigation into why, how the boxing business is working, and if it's working fairly, this guy needs a shot. Now, at that point, Hagler defeated over 10 rounds old bad Benny Briscoe, and Arum signed him, and Arum got him the title shot. So 1979 in Las Vegas, he had to fight Vito Antuofermo over 15 rounds for the undisputed middleweight championship of the world. So, it was a good fight. Most people thought Hagler won. Hagler says at the end of the fight, Mills Lane, who was the referee, came up to him and said, well done. You've won that. Stand over here. When I raise your hand, it was announced as a draw. So it was a split decision draw. So, Hagler was incredibly frustrated at this, really felt he'd won, really felt he'd done enough. And again, kind of go back to this feeling that Hagler had that the system was against him. Nobody wanted to let him through. Nobody wanted to let him win. If they had a chance to jip him, they were going to jip him, and he really felt that he'd been scammed at this fight. So, he went off and, had another 3 knockout wins against leading contenders. Vito Antuofermo went off and fought Alan Minter. Lost to Alan Minter on points, and then fought Alan Minter again in a rematch and lost by TKO. So then we come round to 1980, September 1980, and Minter gives Hagler a shot at the title at Wembley Arena. Now, this fight is kind of notorious in British boxing for all the wrong reasons, I'm afraid. So Hagler came over to Wembley. There was a stirring up around the fight, around racial identities. Minter is said to have said, in an interview with Des Lynam, I'm not going to lose my title to a black man. The NF got involved, and Minter, by the way, who wasn't racist anyway, said he was told to say that. He was, they were stirring out for the fight. It wasn't his words. But anyway, there was a horrible racial overtone on the fight. On the night at Wembley, it was packed with football hooligans, NF supporters. Everybody was taking in slabs of beer, all this sort of thing. Hagler, determined not to leave it this time in the hands of the judges, absolutely destroyed Minter. Absolutely came at him. To be fair to Minter, Minter was saying to Hagler, come on, in the third round, and went sort of headlong at him. But Hagler was ferocious, relentless, and 2 southpaws incidentally in there. And Minter was taken over at the middle of the third round to his corner to look at 4 very bad cuts on his face. They said, no, that's it. Doug Bidwell, his manager, said that's the end of that. We're not fighting anymore. Instantly, beer cans, bottles started to rain on the ring. The Petronelli brothers tried to shield Hagler. The police came in to try and shield Hagler. He had to be taken out of the ring with beer bottles raining down on him, booze and screams, coins, bottles being thrown at him, just to be protected to get out of the ring. So, incidentally, another thing, of all the stellar records that Marvin Hagler set in his career, he's the only champion not to receive his belt in the ring. Because as soon as he'd won the fight, he literally fell to his knees with his hands up, and in relief, and he must have been there for about 2 seconds, and everything started coming into the ring, and they had to get him out of there. Again, part of Hagler's tough upbringing, part of the feeling that he never got a break, one of the things that he didn't even get to receive his title in the ring. So he also said he'd never come back to Britain again, which he never did to box in his career. He did later when he was retired, but it left a bad taste in the mouth. Now, he would finally got to the mountaintop. He fought Vito Antuofermo, incidentally, in his 50th fight. So, that's how long it had taken him. That's how much of an apprenticeship he'd served before he even had a title shot. Then he had that draw. Then he finally got to fight Alan Minter and won the title. Now he'd got to the mountaintop. This man was not going to let it go. There's always this adage of, fight like a champion, train like a challenger. And if anybody ever did, it was Marvin Hagler. When he used to go into training camp, he used to call it prison. And it was very sparse. He was very mean to his sparring partners. He was dedicated. He always said, if you cut my big bald head open, what you'll find in there is just a boxing glove. I live it, I eat it, I breathe it, I sleep it. And that was very much what he did. So, the defences started to rack up. In the end, he was to get a run of 12 successful title defences. And these were all #1 challengers, and contenders that he was fighting. They were all knockouts. Until 1983. Incidentally, another interesting thing, he changed his name by deed poll in 1982 from Marvin Nathaniel Hagler, because a lot of the broadcasters were not using his nickname, Marvelous Marvin Hagler, because they said, well, that's not his given name. We'll decide whether he uses his nickname or not. So he went to change his name by deed poll to Marvelous Marvin Hagler, so they had to use it. Incidentally, that's when it came out that he'd been lying about his age by 2 years, and he was actually born in 1954, not 1952. So, his following started to grow. People started to love this guy. Well, love is maybe the wrong word. Hagler was always kind of looking for love. People didn't love Hagler. He didn't have the winning smile. He had menace. He had threat. But people respected him. People respected his toughness, his durability, his excitement. So he started to rack up the defences. In 1983, he fought Roberto Duran. Duran stepped up from light middle to fight Hagler. And that was a great fight. That was really 2 guys who would bring it and just stood in the middle of the ring, really slugging it out, really fighting. I mean, they were both, amazing technicians, but they really had it. They really wanted to have it with each other, and they let it all hang out. And Hagler always said Duran, he thought, was his best opponent, because Duran really came to fight. He said so many other guys ran, but Duran really came to fight. But that was the first time, in a title defence that anybody had managed to go the distance with Hagler. And again, the title defences kept racking up. And then we come to 1985 and Tommy Hearns. Now, Tommy Hearns had just knocked out Roberto Duran in 2 rounds and knocked him out stunningly. People thought nobody can stand up to that Tommy Hearns right hand. So they were built to fight, again, Caesars Palace, Las Vegas. And it was billed as the fight, and it became known as the war. And it really became a defining moment for Hagler. The first round of that fight is what Hagler's all about. In some ways, it's what boxing's all about. It's just incredible. It looked like something out of another age. It was the most exciting first round ever. Hearns connected with that right hand flush in the first 15 seconds on Hagler. Hagler took a step back for a second and then came forward. He was relentless. He gritted his teeth. He came at Hearns. Hearns stood there and traded, and they just would not stop throwing power punches throughout the entire first round. It's absolutely phenomenal. If anybody hasn't seen it, go back and watch it. Now, incidentally, we weren't privy to this after the fight, but Hearns broke his hand at the end of round 1, his right hand, and so elected to box more in round 2, and Hagler was pursuing, really relentlessly again. And so but couldn't really catch up with Hearns. And then in the third round, Hagler was cut. Hagler was on top. Hagler thought he had Hearns and he was winning, but a bad cut opened up on his head, dripping into his eye. The fight was stopped. Hagler was sent to a corner to see the referee, and you can see the look on Hagler's face of, they're going to stiff me again. They're going to steal this from me. They're out to get me again. So the doctor looked at the cut. Luckily for Hagler, the doctor said, no, you can carry on. So Hagler came running after Hearns and looping right hook behind the ear. Hearns, and quickly Hearns was down. The fight was over. And, it was 2.5 rounds of kind of mayhem. And like I say, the first round is, I would say, the best round of most exciting round of boxing I've ever seen. And it kind of came to epitomise what Marvin Hagler is all about. Whatever you throw at him, he will walk through. Whatever you bring to him, he will bring more fire. So, it was a defining moment for Hagler. What had been stalking Hagler all through his career was Sugar Ray Leonard, who had kind of dipped in and out, but the name was always mentioned. A bit like, we might remember recently, every time Floyd Mayweather had a fight or Manny Pacquiao had a fight, they would mention the other one and say, when are you going to fight him? When are you going to fight him? And the talk about Leonard was always stalking Hagler. And Hagler, again, with that bit of a chip on the shoulder, always thought, Leonard had it easy. Like I say, he had that stellar amateur career. Everybody fated him when he turned pro. It was, he had a kind. What Hagler saw from where he'd come from was a bit of an easier ride. And Sugar Ray Leonard would dip in and out. And to be honest, Sugar Ray Leonard teased Hagler a bit because Hagler knew this was the big payday. He was desperate to fight Leonard. And, at one point, Leonard even said, look, I'm going to make a big announcement about my career. Marvin, I'd like you to be there. And Marvin came along thinking, here we go. He's going to announce it. We're going to fight. And with everybody in the audience, including Hagler, Leonard said, everybody would love to see the Hagler fight, wouldn't you? Everybody would love to see it. Oh, the money would be unbelievable. Imagine what would be on the table. The whole world wants to see that fight, but it will never happen because I'm retiring. And Hagler was like, I've just been used as a prop in this guy's story. So there was a bit of, animosity there. And, so Leonard retired. Hagler carried on. After the Hearns fight, there was the Mugabe fight, and that was a war. I mean, Mugabe came with, a ferocious slugger, 26 fights, 26 wins, 26 knockouts, and came to fight Hagler, brought it to Hagler, and again, Hagler prevailed. But that was a super hard fight. And people started to say, and ringside was Sugar Ray Leonard, and people started to say maybe Hagler's slipping a bit. The footwork, the hand speed and the foot speed isn't really there anymore. He's sitting down a bit more. He's becoming more of a slugger, rather than the real sort of skillful boxing that he used to exhibit with that power. He's more like, come on, I'll just have it with you, and I'll just out trade you. And also, he did take a lot of damage in that fight, and people thought, well, maybe the ring rust is starting to show, particularly Sugar Ray Leonard. Hagler took about a year off after the Mugabe fight and was also toying with retirement. And then Sugar Ray Leonard famously invited Hagler to his restaurant and was talking to him. And like I say, Leonard, whether I could say this, was always kind of Hagler's friend, but maybe not Hagler's friend, because Leonard had his eye on something else. And so, he was famously talking to Hagler, and Marvin was saying, you know what, I just haven't got the motivation anymore. I find it difficult to get up in the morning and do my road work. And, it just, the punches hurt a little bit more than they used to, and et cetera, et cetera. The talk of someone, who's maybe thinking you've got one foot in the ring and one foot out of the ring. And after what Leonard has seen, in the previous few fights, he thought, now's the time. And so Leonard said, I want to fight Hagler, and came out and said, I want to fight Hagler. So this was mega. It was a huge fight. People were split down the middle. Like I say, people loved Sugar Ray Leonard. He had that winning smile, that easy charm, that chat, but people respected Hagler. So lots of people were talking about this fight, arguing over how it was going to go. It was the boxer against the fighter. It was it was the skills against the strength. It was the slugger against it was the bull against the matador sort of thing. And but people were saying, Sugar Ray Leonard has only had one fight in 5 years. He's been dipping in and out of retirement. How can he possibly compete with Hagler, who has been so active? But what people didn't know was that Sugar Ray Leonard actually had some behind closed door fights, like proper fights with judges, with timekeepers, with gloves, with no head guards. And so he was more prepared than people thought. So this fight came about, this huge event came about in 1987. Again, Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas. And, everybody who was anybody was there. The negotiations for the fight, in the negotiations for the fight, Leonard pushed very hard, again, looking for every sort of angle that he could get. He wanted a 22-foot square ring, a huge ring at the time, much bigger than Hagler had been used to boxing in. And obviously that was because Leonard was going to use the ring. He was going to use his legs. He was going to use his boxing skills. He wasn't going to come straight at Hagler, like these other people had, and stand there and trade with him like Duran had, like Mugabe had, like Hearns had, because obviously look what happened to them. So, Hagler wanted the big ring. Leonard wanted the big ring. He also negotiated 10-ounce gloves, not 8-ounce gloves. He also negotiated, and this was very key, a 12-round fight, not a 15-round fight. So these were all things in the contract that went in Leonard's favour. In the end, Leonard said, look, why don't you take a bigger share of the purse, a bigger share of the huge purse, and give me these concessions. In the end, Hagler was like, do you know what, let him have the big ring, let him have the bigger gloves, let him have the short rounds, because I'm going to get him. There's no way he can stay away from me for 12 rounds. However big the ring is, I'm going to walk him down. In the end, we're going to end up in that corner. We're going to end up on the ropes. Give him those concessions. We'll take the money and let's do it. So 1987, this fight came around. And to this day, people argue about it. So, it's very much a case of what you want. At the time, the press was split 50-50 over who won. It was a split decision win for Leonard. At the time, the press were probably 50-50 over who won. The judges were obviously 50-50 over who won. And the public were 50-50 over who won. And things haven't really changed over time, Peter. People are still saying it's what you like. Leonard tended to steal rounds with flashy little bursts at the end of the round. He definitely won the first couple of rounds. That's about all people agree on, that the first 2 rounds went to Leonard. Maybe the first 3. And then, after that, Hagler started to come on a bit stronger. The middle rounds were really Hagler. It was all to play for coming into the last round or last 2 rounds. And, Leonard did tend to kind of steal things. He moved around a lot. He boxed very flamboyantly, real big flashes of skill and very noticeable stuff tended to come at the end of the round. And the decision was announced that Marvin Hagler had lost, and Hagler thought they'd done it to me. They finally stolen my titles. He was adamant that he had totally won the fight. Hagler said, and the ringside camera seemed to back him up on this, and the recordings, that at the end of the fight, Sugar Ray Leonard turned to him and said, "You beat me, man." And so they both raised their hands after the fight, but Hagler said, even Leonard said, "You beat me." And but when it was announced, Hagler was just disgusted. And again, it was what had been following him his whole life. He never got a fair shake. Whatever he did, if he left any chance for him to be shafted, they'd shaft him. So he was really disgruntled, really annoyed. He walked off into the distance, had a hard time dealing with it. He chased that rematch with Leonard for a year, and Leonard was never going to give him a rematch. He chased that for a year because Leonard promptly retired again. Hagler was saying, "Come on, let's do it again, let's do it again." Leonard was like, "No, no, no." In the end, then Hagler also had marital problems. He got divorced. His wife got custody of the children, everything else. So, and he was having a hard time dealing with the loss. So it wasn't a good time for him post the fight. He finally, in 1988, said, "Look, do you know what? I'm not going to bother with this anymore. I'm walking away from boxing." He said he would only stay to fight Leonard again. And now he said, "I'm not fighting him, I'm going," because Leonard was still in retirement. Ironically enough, a few months later, Leonard came out of retirement and said he was going to fight Donnie Lalonde, at the new super middleweight limit. But Hagler was like, "No, I'm finished with it. I've made my decision." He actually moved to Milan, and he became a film star. He started acting in films. There was Indio 2, a number of movies where he was the leading man, and he was relatively successful in this. And he seemed to, find some peace in Milan. He married, he'd been married again over there, and just seemed to be a lot more happier and a lot more at peace. In the later years, he did sort of seem to reconcile himself a lot to the loss. He still disputed it, as so many people do, but he reconciled it a bit. He reconciled himself to Sugar Ray Leonard, came back to England. And even Hagler said, ever since that fight, every English person I met apologises to me about that night. So, he didn't really hold that animosity. Came back to him a number of times. Obviously became very popular when he would. It wasn't a big one for this, but he would, if he would go on after speaking, after the speaking tours, he was honoured, with induction into the Boxing Hall of Fame. He had all the accolades. He did finished up with this amazing record of 65 fights, 62 wins. So there's 3 losses and 2 draws, and there was a 78% knockout ratio, like I say, and just those incredible fights that he left us with. I mean, for me, if I'm going to take the pinnacle, I think it's that first round with Hearns. It's just amazing to watch. But also the fights with Duran, and all those defences before. And we got to remember that it was his 50th fight before he even got a shot at the title against Antifermo. He had to come through that cauldron of middleweight fighters in Philadelphia. So, you know, he was just outstanding and unbelievable all the way along. And, you know, like I say, he had that iron chin, considering the guys he went up against. And don't forget, you know, in the mid-'80s, he was the only undisputed champion. In an age of fractured titles and transitory champions, Hagler was there, and Hagler would not be moved. You know, he was undisputed and just, you know, would just stayed there. And like I say, became the face of boxing. So, you know, he epitomised so much about a tough, blue-collar, earn your stripes, work your way up the hard way type of mentality. And when you get there, do not let it go. You know, just a superb fighter, you know, an amazing man. And, you know, let's not forget as well, we talk about the bitterness and we talk about the chip on the shoulder, but, you know, he did extremely well. You know, in the end, it was about $40 million worth of purses. He left boxing with his health intact, you know, with his marbles intact, which is the difficult thing to do, you know, and he walked away and he forged another life, and to all intents and purposes was quite happy in that other life. So, you know, it's a real victory, and, you know, God rest him and God bless him. You know, fantastic, amazing man, amazing character, amazing fighter. And, yeah, will we see his like again? I don't know. But God rest Marvin Hagler. Thanks, Peter.